Yeah, I'm just going to maybe introduce us, Justine and I, and the work that we've been researching, work that we've been working on for the past few years. So we've been working as a duo of curators for the past 3-4 years. And our research and work was mainly focusing on the development of a participative archive. We worked a lot on the Mediterranean territory, looking at Mediterranean borderscapes, fluid and solid borderscapes. And we tried to develop with a project that we started, a community-based archive where people could submit contributions and make this data-free of access archive growing. That's focusing on the liminal dimensions of the Mediterranean, from Morocco to the European coasts. So we're really looking at the fragments that we can find at the margins of an archive. But the presentation that we're going to give today, it's not so much related to the Mediterranean, but to another territory. And it's actually a research that we developed as part of the Ocean Fellowship Program, which is a program that's funded by TBA21-Academy, and it's held at the Ocean Space in Venice, in Italy. It's a program that tries to connect and support situated projects, collective pedagogies, and voices along the Mediterranean shores across the fields of art, culture, science, conservation, and activism. So during this residency, we really actually didn't look at the Mediterranean. We looked at Bretagne. If you look at a map, you would see it's the left arm of France. It's surrounded by the sea, by the Atlantic Ocean, and by the sea at the north of the coast of Bretagne. And the research that we did looks at the role played by language, by silence and storytelling in survival strategies that are developed by women from Bretagne and that are passed on from different generations of women, but always from woman to woman. And as we worked around this research and we encountered and met many different people, researchers, but also artists, we really tried to conceive the process of research as an exercise in listening to the stories that teach us how to tell with and how to live with marine environment, and really focusing on these coastal communities from Bretagne. It's usually communities of fishermen, families of fishermen, and looking at the culture that these communities have and how deeply connected it is to the sea that really surround the land they live on. And our research was supported since its very, very beginning by a text that we read when we were in Venice. It's written by sci-fi writer Ursula Le Guin, and it's a speech that she wrote and gave at Mills College in '83 for a graduation ceremony. It's called Left-Handed Commencement Address. And although it was written and made public in the '80s, we think that this text is really contemporary and it's really relevant to read in the light of the events going on now in Glasgow and the COP26. So it's important for us to read the text out loud, the full text today. And you will understand why it's so important as we keep on speaking about the research and what notions she addressed in this text that are really at the core of the research that we developed in Venice and that we are still working on now.
A left-handed commencement address. I want to thank the Mills College of '83 for offering me a rare chance to speak aloud in public in the language of women. I know there are men graduating, and I don't mean to exclude them, far from it. There is a Greek tragedy where the Greek says to the foreigner, if you don't understand Greek, please signify by nodding. Anyhow, commencements are usually operated under the unspoken agreement that everybody graduating is either male or ought to. That's why we are all wearing these 12th century dresses that look so great on men and make women look either like a mushroom or a pregnant stork. Intellectual tradition is male. Public speaking is done in the public tongue, the national or tribal language. And the language of our tribe is the men's language. Of course, women learn it. We are not dumb. If you can tell my perception from your reading, or Indira Gandhi from General Somoza by emptying their saying, "Tell me how." This is a man's world, so it talks a man's language. The words are all words of power. You've come a long way, baby, but no way is long enough. You can't even get there by selling yourself out, because there is theirs, not yours. Maybe we've had enough words of power and talk about the battle of life. Maybe we need some word of weakness. Instead of saying now that I hope you will all go forth from this ivory tower of college into the real world and forge a triumphant career, or at least help your husband to and keep our country strong and be a success in everything. Instead of talking about power, what if I talk like a woman right here in public? It won't sound right. It's going to sound terrible. What if I said that I hope for you is first if, only if, you want kids? I hope you have them, not hordes of them, a couple, enough. I hope they're beautiful. I hope you and they have enough to eat and a place to be warm and clean and friends and work you like doing. Well, is that what you went for college for? Is that all? What about success? Success is somebody else's failure. Success is the American dream. We can keep dreaming because most people in most places, including 30 millions of ourselves, live wide awake in the terrible reality of poverty. No, I do not wish you success. I don't even want to talk about it. I want to talk about failure. Because you are human beings, you are going to meet failure. You are going to meet disappointment, injustice, betrayal, and irreparable loss. You will find you're weak when you thought yourself strong. You'll work for possessions and then find they possess you. You'll find yourself, as I know you already have, in dark places, alone and afraid. What I hope for you, for all my sisters and daughters, brothers and sons, is that you will be able to live there in the dark place, to live in the place that our rationalism culture of success denies, calling it a place of exile, unhabitable, foreigner. Well, we're already foreigners. Women as women are largely excluded from, alien to, the self-declared male norms of this society, where human beings are called man. The only respectable God is made. The only direction is up. So that's their country. Let's explore our own. I'm not talking about sex. That's a whole other universe where every man and woman is on their own. I'm talking about society, the so-called man's world of institutionalized competition, aggression, violence, authority, and power. If we want to live as women, some separatism is forced upon us. This college is a wide embodiment of that separatism. The War Games world wasn't made by us or for us. We can't even breathe the air there without a mask. And if you put the mask on, you'll have a hard time getting it off. So how about going on doing things our own way, as to some extent you did here at Greece? Not for men and the male power hierarchy, that's their game. Not against men either, that's still playing by their rules. But with any men who are with us, that's our game. What should a free woman with a college education is a fight macho man or serving? Why should she live her life on these terms?
Macho man is afraid of our terms, which are not rational, positive, competitive, etc. And so, he has taught us to despise and to deny them. In our society, women have lived and have been despised for living the whole side of life that includes and takes responsibility for helplessness, weakness, and illness, for the irrational and the irreparable, for all that is obscure, passive, uncontrolled, animal, unclean. The valley of shadow, the deep, the depths of life. All that the warrior denies and refuses is left to us, and the men who share it with us, and therefore, like us, can play doctor, only nurse, can be warriors, only civilians, can be chiefs, only Indians. Well, so that Well, so that it is our country, the night side of our country. If there's a day side to it, high sierras, prairies of bright grass, we only know pioneers' tales about it. We haven't got there yet. We're never going to get there by imitating Bachoman. We're only going to get there by going our own way, by living there, by living through the night in our own country. So what I hope for you is that you live there, not as prisoners, ashamed of being women, consenting captives of a psychopathic social system, but as natives. That you will be at home there, keep house there, be your own mistress with a room of your own. That you will do your work there, whatever you're good at, art or science or tech, or running a company or sweeping under the beds. And when they tell you that it's second-class work, because a woman is doing it, I hope you tell them to go to hell, and while they're going to give you equal pay for equal time. I hope you live without the need to dominate and without the need to be dominated. I hope you are never victims, but I hope you have no power over other people. And when you fail and are defeated and in pain and in the dark, then I hope you will remember that darkness is your country, where you live, where no wars are fought and no wars are won, but where the future is. Our roots are in the dark, the earth is our country. Why did we look up for blessing instead of around and down? What hope we have lies there, not in the sky full of orbiting spy eye and weaponry, but in the earth we have looked down upon. Not from above, but from below. Not in the light that blinds, but in the dark that nourishes, where human beings were human souls.
So in Venice, we actually stumbled upon this commencement address and we kept rereading it. It was really our research companion. And we were particularly interested in the concept that Ursula coins, that is the dark place. She says it's the place where human beings grow human souls, a place that nourishes and that takes responsibility. And the way Zoe and I understand it is that the dark place is also a place that preserves stories and knowledge that are open door. So it's both a place where stories survive and that also allows people who tell those stories to survive. So the stories in our research, 3 generations removed, are coming from this obscurity. And now, in this present time, living on this restless planet, we are ready to hear, and recover these stories and the knowledge there. As Donna Haraway says in her book, Staying with the Trouble, what's the point of ancient stories if you cannot share the wisdom? So we are really trying to look at how to preserve the stories of survival that were told by women and Daquin, that are stories that teach us how to live and how to be with our environment, and that also teach us the symbolic, social, and political importance of the sea for marginalized existences. But how can we share stories without betraying, compromising, or twisting them? And of course, how can they be used? And also that's what we're going to talk about. So our approach was really to listen to the story we were entrusted with and to try not to instrumentalize. We chose, a month ago, our working title because it's ongoing research, and we called the research Takes Hold Women. So it's actually a direct translation from the French saying, Conte de bonne femme, which is a very pejorative saying, because it implies that those tales who are told by women about themselves are of no importance or even untrue. So the idea to give this title to our research was really to reclaim this pejorative saying and say to the world, no, it is important and it is, of course, true. So yes, we are convinced that listening to those stories throughout generations can help us reshape our approach to the world. So part of the research focuses on the stories of mom and Janet, a mother and daughter, who were actually my grandmother and my great-grandmother. And they lived in Bretagne in the last century. And their lives were truly very difficult in lives of survival. Mom was a healer, and Jannick was forced to change her name by the French state and to give up speaking Bretagne dialect. Their stories were shared within the family nucleus as jokes or anecdotes, which I understand because it's actually a very smart way for a story to stick with us for a generation. If you say it as a tale or as a joke, then it will be transmitted. But then it's very difficult for us. For example, it's very difficult for me to recover the actual knowledge the story bears.
Yeah, I think what we realized during the research, I mean, I think we were already aware of that before, but it became really clear when we started working around this topic that, you know, language plays a very important role among the mechanisms responsible for dispossessing people from their relationship to the sea. And when I speak to the sea, I speak to the land, I speak about the environment, but also for dispossessing them from their own narratives. Because language distributes power, because language is power, the power on language make things appear and others disappear. And we were really interested in looking at the practices of resistance that are often silent, subterranean, and slow acts of insubordinations that enable marginal narratives to survive, and with them the literacies that teach us how to live with the more than human, how to live with the sea, how to live with death, with grief, and with fear. And so I'm going to show you a short extract from a sound piece that I realized when I was doing this residency with Justine at the Ocean Space. It's called Better Close the Shutters. And it was presented as an installation, as a sound installation during our research presentation at the Ocean Space. It's co-produced by TBA21-Academy, and it is based on a series of interviews that I conducted between 2018 and 2019, sorry, with Marie-Cole, who is a family's lifelong neighbor from Porzeven, a small fisherman's village facing Paimpol's Bay and Archipelago in Bretagne, in Côte d'Armor. So Marie-Cole used to live 2 houses away from where my great-grandmother bought a house in 1965. In Breton, Côte d'Armor is Aoudou an Arvor, which means coast of the sea country. Like many people there, Marie came from a family of fishermen. She bought a house in Porzeven with her husband when she was 30 years old, and she never left. Since birth, she suffered from an illness that partially deprived her from her mobility and forced her to spend years of her life in a cast and then in a wheelchair when she grew older. And when I visited her in Porzeven, we used to sit in her living room by the bay window overlooking the sea. In December 2018, I asked her if she would agree to talk to me about her relationship to the sea. My last visit to Marie was in the summer 2019 in August. She had asked me to dig up old photo albums from the dusty boxes that she was storing in her bedroom. And she kept on spinning out memories about her relationship with the sea. And the story that Marie entrusted me with was told and molded in her words, in her speaking. And her speaking was a kind of in-house speaking, a better close the shutter speaking. And you better close the shutters is something that she said at the very beginning of the interview when she decided to tell me a story about her relationship to the sea. And so I selected 3 different passages from this sound piece and the interviews that I had with her. And I'm gonna show them to you. I'm gonna share my screen now. And you will see how, if you see it, but I think you will, how it resonates with the text of Ursula Le Guin. And it's also gonna bring the next discussion that we're gonna have about being dispossessed from a relationship to the sea, being dispossessed from the relationship to a certain environment and to a language that's really, you know, carved by this territory, shaped by the environment, and that's different from the state's language and the language of power.
Ici, il y a de quoi s'amuser, s'occuper et se faire plaisir. Hein. On n'a pas de grandes plages, on n'a pas de belles plages, mais on a la nature sans qu'on l'a bougé, quoi. Ouais. Moi, ma vue est pareille maintenant qu'il y a 40 ans. Hein. C'est dingue. Même soi-même, quand moi je suis là depuis 50 ans, bah, tu vois, j'ai autant de plaisir à regarder. Tu vois là-bas sous les cailloux, là, et tu vois tout à fait, je vais dire en breton, parce que, attends, tout à fait au Gourlande. Et ben quand elle commence à descendre, tu vois que les cailloux sont humides. Mais là, tu vois, avant, tu vois, il y a une dizaine d'années à peu près, tu serais venu à Port-Zeven, tu aurais pu embarquer avec un grand bateau comme ça, en lui demandant est-ce que je pourrais aller avec vous. Moi, je serais allée vers lui parce que c'est un neveu, et je lui aurais dit, tu peux prendre un petit ici, elle a envie d'aller faire un tour en mer, enfin, tu vois. Et bien maintenant, ils n'ont plus le droit. Ils ont une sacrée amende si on les a. Ouais, ils n'ont plus le droit. Ils n'ont le droit que si la personne est embarquée. Ah bon. C'est dommage qu'il n'y a pas des bateaux qui promènent les gens comme ça une journée, quoi, tu vois. Même un enfant à toi, j'ai un neveu qui habite juste quand tu descends la petite côte ici, en bas, où il y a un joli jardin à ta droite, là. Eh ben, il n'a pas le droit d'envoyer son fils à lui. Son fils.
So I think these extracts from the sound piece are interesting because they address the question of a rupture in transmission, both through body and spoken language. The sound piece lasts 20 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to show the whole piece now, but if you want to listen to it, you can get in touch with us and we'll send it to you. But the story it tells is a story of grief, of love, and of irreparable loss. It's about a rupture between generations in transmission, about how to live with the sea as humans, but also about a rupture in language, the Breton language that was spoken in Bretagne, and raises the question, how can we know, how can we still know when the words and the gestures on which our sensitive experience of the environment we live in rely on disappear? And how to dialogue about and with the environment and how to navigate in it as humans. So we have many examples of indigenous communities being dispossessed from their relationship to the environment they live in. The story is the same. And it's about small-scale fishermen that are not able to bring their kids on their boats to teach them how and what to fish and when, what not to fish, where not to go, what areas to avoid, how to use a boat, how to use a rope, how to work with a crew on sea, how to love the sea, how to respect it. So to me, and to Justine as well, I think it's really about survival and preservation of the sea and of humans. And yeah, it's interesting to see that, you know, people from Bretagne still fight to preserve their like this relationship that they have to the sea, because it's always been a difficult one. And maybe if you wanna.
Yes, it's always been a difficult one because, of course, the water there is very cold and the currents are very violent. But somehow they had to go at sea. So again, give maybe two examples. Like the first example is that before the late 60s, there was no road connecting Bretagne to Paris. So if you wanted to do commercial exchanges, you could not go, you could not exchange with France. So they had to go at sea to exchange with Ireland and with Iceland. And the second example is that you cannot grow much in Bretagne. It's really not a very interesting land for agriculture. So to survive, they had to go fishing. So they had to go to sea. So in a way, they had to make friends with the very difficult water elements. So yeah, that's quite interesting. They had to build a relationship with the sea. But it's important to say that not all Bretons were fishermen or sailors, especially in the last century. There were a lot of people, and especially women, who were staying on land and had a relationship with the sea without even physically touching it, because women could not, like, they were not taught how to swim, and they had to stay on land. So we are asking now, in the light of COP26, what about those who stay on land? Those who live in a difficult marine environment without ever being in physical contact with this element. Living in a difficult marine environment creates strategies of survival on land. We can learn from them if we listen closely. Those strategies, and especially in the last century, were essentially incarnated by women, as I said. So focusing on these stories, these survival strategies, is, in our opinion, as important today as analyzing directly the oceans. Indeed, most of the humans on this planet will have to live, and hopefully outlive, the consequences of the oceans rising, tsunamis or storms, and they will do it for the majority of them from the coast and fatally as human beings.
Yeah, I think Porzeven, the village I was speaking about, and in which Marie, the woman I had these interviews with, came from, is a good example to understand the place held by the sea in small coastal communities in terms of heritage and memory. Porzeven is a place that's really imbued with loss, with a history of humans going at sea and never coming back, of really like human memory carved into stones. So it's really very present in even the landscape of the village, in nature and in the built landscape. And like many people around here, Marie came from a family of fishermen. She moved from Paimpol to Porzeven, two villages that are really close to each other, when she was 30 years old, and she never left the place. Her house was built along a very thin piece of land facing the sea, so facing Paimpol's Bay and an archipelago. And from her house, if you can try to imagine in your head and try to locate yourself in this kind of like imaginary landscape that you probably don't know, but if you get out of her house, you just have to follow a path out of the residence on Rue de la Cité Fleurie, turn right, take a narrow passage wedged between the two usually overly well-trimmed hedges that often buzz in the summer and are gloomy in the winter. And when you leave the path behind you, you will see it. You will see Croix-Belle right there. I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to share my screen. It's a granite cross that was built in 1714 with stones from a chapel that was struck by lightning. And I used to stand on the same promontory facing the sea. I'm going to share my screen so you can see it. Okay. Okay, can you see it? Yeah? Okay. So the cross was built in 1714. Yeah, that's what I said. And it's really facing the sea. It's really, it's like the location of the cross is really, really interesting. In Breton, Croix-Belle means cross in the far. So it overlooks the bays of Launay, Paimpol, and an archipelago. And Porzeven and Paimpol are particularly well known for having been the place of departure of the great fishing, which is a time of Icelandic cod fishing campaigns. So sending thousands of men at sea from 1852 to 1935. About 2,000 of them never came back. 2,000 men never came back from the great fishing. And so for decades, the cross was a meeting point for the families of the sailors who had left for several months to the Icelandic Sea. And from there, they could see the boats leave and later scrutinize the horizon, hoping for boats to return. Croaspel still exists and stands on the same promontory. It's also called the Widow's Cross. It's been renamed the Widow's Cross. And it's present in all the tales that children are told, you know, both real and like real stories and from families from Parsevan, but also imaginary stories. And so the sea in the narrative that we are talking about and looking at in our research is both a crucial social, political, and symbolic space. In Marie's story, the sea is also the space she looks at to remind herself of the life that she had and that made her happy, that gave her hope to live as a human on Earth. It's a space in which she learned insubordination, freedom, and love from human relationships to the sea. And when she told me her stories about how she survived as a physically disabled woman married to a physically disabled man in a society where bodies that are unable to produce any kind of capital accumulation, whether it be labor or children, are considered obsolete, useless, and dysfunctional, she was definitely acknowledging the role played by the sea and the non-human, offering her and him a safe space to grow, to live, and to die in. And so what she got from the sea was care and their relationship to the sea. So, I mean, yeah, the relationship to the sea was very important. Her husband was completely obsessed with the sea, and she deplores in the sound piece and in the interviews that I had with her, she deplores the progressive rupture forced between coastal indigenous communities and their relationship to the sea, whether it be cultural, spiritual, economic, or social. And language is really a crucial element to maintain this relationship, both body language, as I said before, so gestures that could be passed on, spoken language, like Breton language and dialects, and stories, narratives. For the sea is really a place of healing in her story. And I'm going to share, oh no, you can still see my screen, right? I can hear you. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna share one more extract from the sound piece, in which she speaks a lot about her husband and his obsession with the sea. I think it's interesting for you to hear that.
Je suis mariée en 63.
Oh, sorry.
Je suis mariée en 63, il est mort il y a 3 ans. Ben non, il y a plus que ça. Il y a 5 ans qu'il est mort. Qu'est-ce que je raconte? Ça fait 9 ans qu'il est mort. Ça fait 9 ans qu'il est mort. Mais il a aimé son métier. Oh, Jean-Jacques adorait son métier. Et en étant photographe, il faisait des correspondances dans le journal, tu vois. Il écrivait des papiers qu'il avait envie d'écrire sur un marin. C'est toujours vers la pêche, hein. Ça c'est sûr. Hein. Il aurait fait la pêcheur s'il avait eu un corps pour le faire, quoi, tu vois. Tellement il adorait la pêche. Il avait un joli bateau, hein. Attends, je vais te dire. Tiens, tu vois la vedette blanche là, au large là. Pas au large là-bas, hein. Ici là, devant le bateau plat, assez plat là. Hein. Et bien un tout petit peu plus petit que ça. Il avait une vedette comme ça. Oh, il a eu du plaisir. Oh là là, il aimait ça. Il adorait aller à la pêche. Et quand il levait ses bras comme ça, c'est qu'il avait du poisson. Il a été malheureux le jour où il a vendu son bateau. Parce qu'on ne l'a pas gardé puisqu'il ne pouvait plus y aller, quoi. Mais il avait du plaisir. Il a pêché du poisson. Oh, que je ne savais pas quoi faire avec. Yvette, ma soeur, elle avait 4 enfants, j'aurais du poisson. Elle n'a jamais acheté un morceau de poisson. Dans son week-end, dès qu'il avait un moment de libre, hop là. Moi j'étais 2 ou 3 fois aussi. Mais moi, tu vois, quand j'étais dans un bateau, je regardais ça. Oh là là, comment on fait pour ne pas couler dans l'eau ici, quoi. Et pourtant, film marin, quand même, j'aurais pas dû avoir peur.
so yeah, that's very interesting what Zoe said about the spoken and unspoken language that could not be transmitted, because actually there are two institutions that completely jeopardize the possibility of transmission in Britain. That's Church and the French state. And so they acted, both institutions acted as mechanism of total dispensation of indigenous practices that often related to practices of survival in a difficult and isolated environment. And so illustration of those mechanisms can be found in the story of Mom and Jack. It was the women that I was telling you about earlier. And that are part of our which stories of Mom was a penseuse du secret, which means healer of secrets in French. She was my great-grandmother. Nobody remembers her real name. She could cure cows and also humans. She could predict the future. She knew the time of her own death. And she could turn off TVs and radio with just a wave of the hand. And maybe we can pass on the PDF. Yeah, so I gathered two fragments that I started recording what my colleague was telling me about those two women when we started the research. And I gathered two fragments. So the first one, I'm not going to read it, but it's really my family telling me that she was hearing crows and goats. And while doing so, she was, of course, saving those animals and creating a relationship with them. But she could also get food for her family, for herself and for her family, so survive. And she was kind of famous for it. And the second fragment relates to how she stopped practicing healing, which was very early on in her life. And so she was really Christian, as every lot of people. And her confessor, so the priest, told her to stop her bed of rape. And so from this moment on, she wouldn't show her abilities, let's say, in public, and not even in front of her own family. So this is the first rupture and transmission that I can tell you about. But what I really want to add is that Mom, what is interesting is that Mom still wanted us to know she was a healer. So she transmitted her story as a tale, through jokes, through anecdotes. And in a way, it was a way for the story, they said, to stick and to survive throughout generation, telling the what. What was my survival strategy, even if she could not say the how. So in a way, she left me a clue, or me or my sister, my cousins. She left us clues that we have to decrypt. Is that a word? To understand how to survive now on this planet and in what is going to be a very difficult marine environment very soon. And the second illustration is about language. And so it's the second institution in the French state that forbade Breton people to speak their language at school and at church. And so my grandmother was originally called Jeannick Asquette, and she was forced by the French state to change her name to Jeanne, to franchise it in a way. So in a matter, like before even her 20th birthday, she went from Jeannick Asquette to Jeanne Asquette, and then to Jeanne Daquin because she got married to my grandfather. So she was completely dispossessed of her identity. And in her case, then we have like this left us without any clue of where she came from or who she was as a human being in a way. And so that's truly the second rupture. And after that, she never spoke Breton. So she refused to speak the language. So these two examples show that two institutions that were really present in this region in the last century created a dramatic rupture, leaving us 3 generations later groping in the dark. In her thesis, Plus de Breton, Eva Vetter is describing the Breton language as the language of shame and the language of the other sin, So truly the ocean can be understood as the dark place. And so it's the place of the intimate and the unspoken, let's say. So that's quite interesting. And actually, when we did the research with you, we really wanted to talk about this research with female scientists, artists, activists that were working on the sea and get their impression about the research and, of course, ask them questions about their practice. And we interviewed Åsa Andersson, that is another activist, and Sami here, so she's from Scandinavia. And she was saying something very interesting that happened to healers in Samiland. She says, shaming is a methodology of power to correct people into the right thinking. And the first step to recover lost knowledge is to use words from the culture, except Zoe and I spoke Bottom, of course, so how can we recover it? And you can see actually in the... non, c'est pas ça, c'est à la fin, ça. Yeah, it was not this quote, but it's fine. And so, like, what is interesting also in Zoe's piece, you said that you saw that when Marie was speaking about the wetness of the rock, she said the word in Breton that was not translated because Zoe could never find out where it was. So that's quite a powerful example. And we wanted also to, quickly go back on something that was said before, is this kind of ambivalence the Breton people have with the water elements. The water element being the first source of death and the first source of life. And it's quite interesting because we might, us in a close future, find ourselves in the same situation that the Breton people, as the Breton people. So we might be really afraid of this element. But how did these people face fear, and how can we learn from them? There is definitely a fear of water in Japan, but that's one that's, the fear seems to be accepted and not fought against. As I said, there the water is cold and the currents violent, so the water element is really unamicable and you have to make friends with it. What I think is very interesting is Breton people had to be humble in the face of the water element because they had no choice. So they had to be humble in the face of its unknowability and unpredictability. Yes. So the sea, cold and unpredictable, has become part of the very identity of the Breton people. Actually, this weekend, I was in Bretagne to see my family. I didn't mention at all the research, but my cousin told me something that I thought was very interesting regarding to that. He said, so he's a ferry pilot. He's piloting ferry from France to the UK, actually. And he said, like, us Breton people, we are crazy. We are always complaining about working at sea. But every time someone says, oh, you should change your career path, our answer is always the same. No way, never. I have salt water running through my veins, which I think is very beautiful. And this question of fear seems to be more and more present in contemporary discourse. For example, I participated in the Anthropocene Campus in Venice a few weeks ago, and there was a very interesting conference about this topic by historian Ulrike Egmond, and she was talking about fear of water in the Netherlands. So it starts the same, with the same analysis. They are afraid of water because it's the first source of life and it's the first source of death, so they have to make friends with it. The difference is that because of the floods, they have to master it, so create dams, build buildings on water, which is not the case of the Breton people. So I'm asking now, how can we find a balance between the fear-driven run from mastery and the negation of danger? And we believe that at this occasion of COP26, Our research shines a light on non-violent survival strategies. We can learn from those stories, those tales where grief, loss, and fear are fully part of a life lived in a difficult marine environment. And this part of life, and I'm going back to what Ursula Le Guin was saying in her speech, is the one that takes responsibility for the helplessness and the uncontrolled. And I realized while I was writing on the topic a few weeks ago that in English, when you're afraid or there is a danger, you say, be careful. But that's also means it's full of care. So it's really beautiful. And we wanted to conclude the talk with contemporary voices from the present. So from 3 women that we interviewed in the conversation that I was talking about earlier. Those 3 women are Åsa Andersson, the land activist and healer from Scandinavia, Shani Stopinski, who is a complex system marine scientist, and Daria Akenak, who is an oceanographer, and she will be talking actually 1 hour, 2 hours, very, very soon. And it was quite remarkable because every time we had a conversation with them, everybody was kept going back on those 4 topics that we have: magic, grief, love, and fear. So the first quote is from Åsa, and she's talking about fear. The minute we take people out in the woods, they go into fear-driven part of nature, being dangerous somehow. You're preset to be afraid of the unknown. It's a cultural thing, even if it's a super safe place as nature is. It's dark, so you can't see, so you start fantasizing. It is interesting to me what you're saying, because you bring up fear-driven darkness. But in Sami culture, there is no fear-driven darkness in nature. It's the only power you need to relate to in a humble, realistic, and pragmatic way. Because of course nature can be dangerous, but it is only a micro part. The generosity, the healing, the goodness of nature is the rest. Then we have Shani, who's talking about magic. I really like that she's a scientist, so she's the one who's talking about magic. To me, magic is something we experience as being spontaneously generated, and without any understanding of the mechanism that could have led to that, something that appears. When I use that phrase, I do applied magic, she actually says that. I am expanding the concept of emergence, which is really pervasive in existence, and it has a close relationship to magical practices, which I consider to be hypersensitivity to information the rest of the world can't perceive. You don't get to control it, so it is very unappealing to some scientists. And then the last one from Delia was not actually a direct quote from our conversation, but after our conversation, she entrusted us with an amazing sample that she recorded a year ago. And a woman asked her to record herself, explaining what she does as a job, and her see-through discovery. And in the end, she talked about her mother and the death of her mother and how this led her to make one of the biggest discoveries in her life. So it talks about love and hope. And the quote is, I think if you saw how much I struggled to finish my PhD, you would blame yourself for dying, but don't. I could have been stronger. And eventually, I healed. I think the Red Sea healed me. I swam 3 times a day, every day. I could focus on work again. And that's how it happened. We solved a very important problem for the oceans. So je peux passer peut-être la dernière slide du coup. And we just wanted to conclude with a poem from a Breton poet, because it's even better in their own words. And I'm going to read it in French, and there's the English translation. It's my translation, so it might be a bit sketchy, because it's very hard to translate the word demeurer, which means remaining in French, and it also means insane. And I think for this occasion, it's really a beautiful poem. Je ne suis qu'une vieille personne usée par les trop durs travaux. Je ne puis pas beaucoup pour cette génération, mais elle m'est chère. C'est la Bretagne de demain. Mon cœur souffre de leur souffrance. J'ai mal à ma Bretagne, moi, la triplement demeurée bretonne, demeurée chrétienne, demeurée terrienne.